I'll wait till the room is clear. Okay.
Okay. A person has many factors to consider when and where to daven. For example, mincha. They will try to daven at a consistent time, in a consistent place. Davening when one learns their Torah. Davening when one of the first 10 people. Davening after plag. When one can't fulfill all these factors in a single minyan, which factor is the most important to prioritize?
Yeah, so the question would be that there are a lot of rules regarding what is the best place to daven, the place where you learn, the place with a minyan, the place with the larger minyan, the place where more kavana, different zmanim. So it seems that the number one thing you're looking for is to daven when you have the optimal zmanim. So, for example, davening mincha before plag, if you're going to do ma'ariv after plag. I mean, that's going to be the single most important thing. The second will be minyan, obviously, davening b'tzibur over yechidus. Now, the other things are really kind of hard to weigh, meaning there is an inyan of davening in the place where you learn. There actually is an inyan. There's also an inyan of davening in the makam kavua where you normally daven. So let's assume that in the past you were davening in a place that is not where you want to learn, and now you want to change it. So there'll be difficulties. We don't always have a clear priority list. And in such a situation, the tiebreaker will often be where you have the most kavanah. So we're going to bring in that idea there. Because with respect to the other factors, there's not always going to be a clear list. But so I think kavanah zmanim, tzibur, and then kavanah would be the three most important things that you look at.
Rav, what about when you can get tzibur, but you have to make a compromise on zmanim in that you're waiting for the mincha, shkia passes, but it's not.
So it really depends. But frankly, the Mishnah Berurah says specifically, with respect to shkia, sunset, it is better to daven mincha b'yechidos than to daven mincha after shkia. So there we do have it. Now, on other things, such as, like some people say, there's a hidur to daven mincha ketana instead of mincha gedola. There, if you can get a minyan mincha gedola, we would say, go with the minyan. But so it really depends very specifically on which time issue you're focusing on. Another issue that comes up a lot is vasikin. Vasikin is when you time your davening, so the shachris shmona esrei, you will begin with the rising of the sun. So you start davening, whatever it is, a half an hour before that, and you hit shmona esrei with the rising of the sun. That's a very big inyan. That's called davening kavasikin. Now the question is, what if you don't have a minyan? Right? In a lot of communities, you're not going to have a minyan at the time of vasikin, and the minyan will be later. So what do you do? So there, it's actually brought down that if you plan that you're going to be davening kavasikin on a regular basis, then that overrides davening with a minyan. If, on the other hand, one particular morning you happen to get up early, and you're thinking, it's a nice idea for me to daven vasikin, there you do have to go to the minyan. So it really depends on whether vasikin is going to be your permanent practice or whether it's just a one-shot thing. Yeah.
Here's the send-in. It seems that topics like having a healthy relationship with yourself, meditation, mindfulness, etc., are all being neglected in the Torah world, and that the keys to that wisdom are in the non-Jewish world. Why is that?
Yes, so the question is that issues like taking care of yourself, mindfulness, the books keep on coming, presumably from non-Jewish sources, from secular sources, or Eastern religion, or whatever, and why are these subjects neglected in the Torah world? So first of all, I do need to correct that statement a little bit. If you examine the books that are coming out now, certainly in recent years, you will see an explosion of works on mindfulness. I'm aware of at least 3 books that I wrote letters of introduction for, and I'm sure there are many other books besides that. And a lot of issues that were not formally explored in a Torah setting are now being explored. So the truth is there is a lot out there. There really is a lot out there. But why historically, that doesn't answer the question, why historically it wasn't addressed so much. The truth of the matter is that, society, I'm going to use a harsh word, I don't mean to be that harsh, but society has gotten a lot more narcissistic than in the olden days. People are thinking about, I don't feel good, I don't feel that happy, and therefore we need to explore the reasons why I'm not happy, the reasons why, I don't feel fulfilled. I don't mean that that's narcissistic in a negative sense, but it's kind of a focus on what's good for me. I'm just not getting the happiness out of life. Now, you have to know that 100 years ago, even in general society, that wasn't the type of mindset that people had. People saw life as a series of tasks, jobs they had to do, that I have a responsibility to kind of get married, have a family, raise my children, have some productive occupation, and if you're religious, do Torah and mitzvos. And there wasn't so much of a focus on how do I feel about it. People might even laugh if somebody were to ask 100 years ago, I don't feel so happy in my Yiddishkeit. They would have said, okay, so do it if you're not happy, So a lot of the emphasis on self-help and on mindfulness really comes from the fact that we have become a society that is preoccupied with a feel-good mentality. Now, again, there may be positive reasons for that, meaning it could very well be that if people were not addressing those issues in the past, maybe there was a lot of stress that could have been alleviated. But I do think that the whole nature of how society has changed creates a much greater demand. Because listen, instead of asking the question, how come the Torah world doesn't address it and the secular world addresses it? I could tell you that 100 years ago, the secular world didn't address it either. So in a sense, the Torah world is not so discontinuous. Now, it's been pointed out many, many times, it's almost a cliche, that Judaism is not a religion of rights, it's a religion of responsibilities. It's a well-known truism that is stated in many ways. Now, on one level, that's just a question of semantics. If I have a responsibility to help the poor man, isn't that the same as saying the poor man has a right to be helped? It's just, rights and responsibilities are just two sides of a coin. But in reality, I think it is a distinction with significance, because in a rights-oriented philosophy, you wake up in the morning and you ask yourself, what does the world owe me? In a responsibility orientation, you ask, what are my responsibilities to the world, to Hashem, to other people? And Judaism very much focuses on responsibilities. And in the world of responsibilities, there's going to be a little less emphasis on the feel-good aspects of life. Now, the secret is that, ironically, by focusing outside of yourself, you actually achieve an inner happiness in many, many ways. In many, many ways, by focusing on how I can help other people, by trying to make other people have a better life, that actually addresses a lot of my existential loneliness, frustration, and depression. So that's a very interesting payoff. By being less focused on yourself, you actually become a happier person inside of yourself as well. Yeah.
Looking at the halachot of Amalek in Rambam Hilchot Melachim, there's the mitzvah, the classic question, the mitzvah to blot out, annihilate their memory, and the mitzvah never to forget what they did do.
Right.
The teretz that I came up with to this question of how those two things can be, it obviously can't mean that nobody ever remembers who Amalek is anymore, or that it can't be to blot out the name because the name's in the Torah. And we can't obviously erase something from the Torah. So
right.
The teretz that I came up with is what it must mean is that all that's left of them is what they represent to us through the Torah. Their cities, their culture, their individuals, their history, all their details are completely forgotten. So I have two questions. One, is that a legitimate teretz? And two, if it is, can we be said to have successfully accomplished it? That we don't know who they are anymore. Where were their lands? Who were their kings? What was their music? In all the reading I've done through classical Western literature, I've never seen them mentioned.
Amalek, yeah. Yeah, the question that's raised is the famous question where the Torah says, do not forget, remember for eternity what Amalek has done to you. And then the Torah says, eradicate their memory from the face of the earth. Remember to eradicate their memory, right? So the question becomes, if the idea is there should be no remnant, no memory of Amalek in the world, then how could we eternally remember that whose memory is supposed to be eradicated, right? That's a famous contradiction in the Psukim. So the answer that Jordan is suggesting is that obviously, to whatever degree the Torah requires you to remember them, remember their evil, remember what they did, so that is preserved. And when the Torah says eradicate, it means eradicate everything about them beyond the segmented area, the designated area that the Torah wants you to remember, and that is the evil that they perpetuated. So you wouldn't, you shouldn't write a doctoral dissertation on Amalekite music or Amalekite tent building or whatever it would be, because that's nichlal in the chiyuv to eradicate their memory. Yeah, I think it's a plausible answer. I think that's a good answer. In other words, the Torah emphasizes we should remember the evil that they perpetrated, the evil that they represented, and in that way we resolve, not to let it happen again to whatever degree, and also to eradicate that evil tendency within ourselves that may parallel to some degree that which is in Amalek. But you are correct that we should remember no remnant of them outside of that particular area that the Torah wants us to remember. So the question that you then raised was, well, maybe we've done that mitzvah pretty well, because we don't know who Amalek is. We have no evidence as to a remnant of Amalek. We know nothing about their culture. Indeed, has Amalek's memory been erased except for the Torah's mention of Amalek? It's a very good point. I think you have a point there. I wouldn't necessarily say that that's a mitzvah that we did, but in a sense, God kind of ran the world in such a way that Amalek's memory is more or less obliterated from world history. Yeah.
Is it possible to say that we're saying that times change and we became more focused on ourselves?
Yeah.
Is it possible to say that Hashem wants something different of us now, and we want that more mutual self-part?
Yeah, that's actually a very, very interesting question. Thursday night, tomorrow night, I give a shir in Even Shlema, which are the writings of the Gra, and for the Beis Medrash. And there is a passage in the Even Shlema that I think, B'mitzvah Hashem, I'll be doing tomorrow, but I think it's very relevant here. The Gra says that just like there are 6 days of creation, there are 6 millennia until Mashiach, like 6,000 years, even though Mashiach can come early. And just like every day of creation, something different was created, in every millennium, there's a different type of midah of Hashem that becomes dominant in that millennium. And therefore, all of the avoda of Klal Yisrael or anybody is tied into the particular manifestation of godliness that is connected to that generation. Now, unfortunately, the Gra did not specifically delineate what the avoda is, but that does suggest a certain approach to innovation that's very, very interesting. On one hand, we say, the Torah is from God, and even the oral law is from God, etc., and things don't change. On the other hand, there's a lot of things within Torah Judaism. I'm not talking about conservative reform. Within Torah Judaism, that represents change, innovation. What did the Hasidic movement represent, etc.? The Muslim movement. Now, again, these are not totally new. They're taking old ideas, but they're certainly emphasizing certain things. And there actually is a concept. And these movements were criticized, by the way. Anytime somebody is trying to do something new, there's going to be a lot of criticism. But one could legitimately state exactly your point, that as mankind goes through the cycle of history, I don't want to say evolves to a higher level, because in many ways we go lower, but we're different in any sense. The avoda that worked at a certain time and period may not be the appropriate avodas Hashem at a later point. Yes, the Torah does not change, absolutely. The halacha does not change. The mitzvahs do not change. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about reforming Judaism as a system. But within the basic framework of Torah and mitzvos, the particular emotional aspects of personality that one will emphasize may indeed differ from generation to generation. And therefore, that which may not have been appropriate 100 years ago may become appropriate. So you are correct that it may be very possible that maybe what you might call the development of the self is not simply a weakness of our narcissism, but it may be part of God's plan to complete different facets of the human personality that may have been a little incomplete at earlier stages. That's a very good possibility. Now again, you never know, meaning it could be a combination of our Yeridas Hadoros, and it could also be a combination of a Hashgacha Pratis to bring out certain aspects that were not brought out before. Even Kabbalah, that way, people ask the kasha. The Arizal, right? The Arizal created whole world of Kabbalah, not just one word, worlds of Kabbalah. Now the question is, the Arizal was very, very great, but was he greater than the Rambam? Was he greater than Ramban? Was he greater than the Tanoim and Amoraim, who didn't seem to have all of these mystical ideas? So sometimes they claim, oh, they had them, they just didn't say them, but the Pasha says they didn't have them. They didn't have them. The Arizal had certain insights and even revelations that earlier generations didn't have. Does that mean he was greater than them? No, except for the fact that he had this extra revelation, but rather, different generations needed different things. It could very well be at an earlier stage in time, people had a direct and simple connection to God that did not require the complications of Kabbalistic thinking. Later, it was thought that people needed a relationship that was more complex and multifaceted. So yes, there is, this is a long-winded answer, there is an element of hashgacha pratis in the metamorphosis of new ideas entering into the Torah world. It's very, very complicated, and it's also a dangerous idea, so no hate mail, please. The dangerous idea is that in some ways, the rhetoric that I said, the vocabulary that I said, is the very justification for Reform Judaism. So, some guy will get up and make a speech about society changes, human personality changes, we have to have a flexibility in the Torah of Hashem. And lahavdil, this is the same thing they argue about the U.S. Constitution, a living constitution. It has to change, it has to evolve, as opposed to Justice Scalia, who hated the living constitution. He used to say, I don't like living constitutions, I like dead constitutions. He said, I like it the way it was in 1787. In many ways, Scalia actually had a very close affinity to Orthodox Jews. I can tell you this, because he saw Orthodox Jews the same way, that they took their traditions coming from God, and we still with it. We don't say it changes with the times. So I remember I was at kind of a Jewish legal convention that Chabad was organizing years ago, and Justice Scalia was invited to be the main speaker. And in fact, I kept that in my office because at one point, when I was teaching at the University of Maryland Law School, he actually called my office just to get directions or something. So there was a phone message from my secretary, says, Justice Scalia called. So I kind of framed that message for a long time, whatever. But so Scalia got up, he was Catholic. And the first thing that he said was, he really apologizes since he got on the court, he's not able to keep up with Daf Yomi. and the like. But once again, so the point I'm making is, on one hand, I'm telling you, there is a metamorphosis, there is a change, there is a growth, there is a dynamism, there is the notion of new ideas being developed within the framework of Torah. On the other hand, we would reject using that rhetoric for reform and the like. So it's a dangerous way of speaking, but just because it's dangerous doesn't mean it doesn't have truth when it's properly applied. Okay, so I hope that addresses your point a little bit. Yeah?
When I write base on in my paper.
Say again?
When I write base on
yeah.
in my paper, does that go over the other side as well? Or do I have to write it again?
Oh, I see. In other words, Beis Samach Dalet, right? You write on your document, B'siyata Dishmaya, with the help of heaven. So the question is, if you're doing such a thing, should you write it on both sides of the paper, or is the one on side one going to cover you for side two? Again, since it's not a halacha, so it's hard to say what the halacha is, but I think it's better to do it on both sides. So I'll tell you again, so tonight is the night for law school stories for some reason, that, law school exams, like a lot of college exams, are graded anonymously, so people don't write their names, but some of them are handwritten, and this is before computers. And yeshiva guys would often write the Beis Samach Dalet, so at least I would know who they were, or at least I would know they were the from people, and the thought would be, it wasn't true, that I would grade them more leniently and the like. But one time, one of the other law professors asked me, he knew it was Hebrew, but he didn't know what it was. He asked me, what is this thing here? So I said, well, the student is asking for the help of God in doing this exam. So he says, I don't think his God helped him that much. So I just said, well, it could have been worse. You never know. So God can help you much better than it would otherwise would have been. But I think the minhag is to do it on both sides. Yeah.
With AI becoming prevalent, they have services where you can generate voices. So I'm wondering what the approach would be to female voices that are generated through AI, and maybe even a more relevant question today is how does things like auto-tune that are already very prevalent.
Things like what?
Auto-tune, where it sort of enhances the voice or changes
Yeah.
in some sort of way. How does that fit with Kol Isha?
Yeah. So the world of AI, artificial intelligence, is very, very scary, although I actually think it's getting a little less scary than we originally thought. I mean, when AI first came out, it really seemed to be everything that a human brain could do, and that was quite scary. I was thinking to myself, gee, all the rabbis are going to be out of a job here. We'll just have AI to paskin shailas. It does turn out, and I'll get to your question, it does turn out, after very careful analysis, that at least at this point, it is not as profound, not as accurate, not as complete as we might have thought. So right now, it is not going to replace the need for creative, knowledgeable human input. That's the good news. But on the other hand, the technologies do improve, and you never know what's going to be down the road. At this point, AI is really an augmented, perhaps superior way of doing research. In other words, better than Google. Instead of having to look up 20 things or 100 things, AI can give you, everything together, but it cannot really do that much original thinking at this point. We hope never. Now, you're raising some side questions, which are, again, interesting questions, and that is, AI has now moved from text generation, generating text, to generating, pictures, images, voice, including singing voices, and the like. And the question would be, what are the implications of things like kol isha when you have these AI-generated female voices? So it is an interesting question. Let me point out the following. There are shitos that are very, very makel in anything that's not a live singing voice, even if it's an actual recording of a singer. If you took a female singer and you actually had a YouTube recording, there are people who are makel. Some people are makel only if it's an audio, so you don't know what the woman looks like. Some are makel even if it's a video, as long as it's not a live Zoom feed or something, because once it's recorded, it is not considered to be a human voice. Now, if you go with the opinions that say that even a recorded human voice is not within the prohibition of kol isha, then I think kal v'chomer, an AI-generated voice, would not be nichlal in kol isha. The question is, if you're machmir on a recorded voice, at least if there's also a picture or an image, so the question would be, would AI fall under that category? I honestly don't know. I think there would be at least a shaila like those opinions, but I don't think I've seen any particular psak on it. So it's something to think about, something to work on. But as I say, I am fairly confident that if you're makel on recorded human voices, you would be makel on this as well. Yeah.
I was interested in the halacha that the Rambam cites that the king is allowed to have, how do you pronounce it,
Pilagshim.
Pilagshim, only him.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you could tell us some details about this. Why? What was the role of the pilagish? Am I pronouncing that right?
Yeah, pilagish.
What's the role of the
Yeah.
pilagish in the king's life, or why would he want one? Why would she want to become one? Can you tell us any more details, like any interesting?
Yeah. So first of all, it's important to know generally that there is a concept in Chumash and in Nach as well called the pilagish, which is defined as a concubine or a mistress. And there's a machlokas rishonim. What is the difference between a pilagish and a wife, right? There's a wife and there's a pilagish. So according to some rishonim, according to most rishonim, including the Rambam, a pilagish has kedushin. There was a maisa kedushin plus a kesuva. That's an isha, that's a wife. A pilagish is without marriage at all, quite literally, a mistress or a concubine. So most say a pilagesh is a woman without kedushin. There is another view that actually says even a pilagesh has kedushin, but she agreed to forego a kasuva. So she's also a wife, but she's a wife that doesn't have the economic protections of kasuva. But that's a minority opinion. Let's go with the Rambam's opinion generally, that pilagesh is an unmarried woman without kedushin, without kasuva. Now, there is a big machlokas. There are shitos and rishonim who say even a non-melech is allowed to have a pilagesh. Quite amazingly, Rav Yaakov Emden brings us that pilagesh is mutter. Now, this is not to be taken halacha l'maisa. We don't paskin this way. But the Rambam and Rav Yosef Karo in the Shulchan Aruch, they all paskin that there's an isser d'oraisa for a Jewish man to have intercourse with a single woman outside of kedushin. It's an isser d'oraisa, and therefore the concept of a pilagesh is halachically prohibited for anyone other than a melech. Right? That's the Rambam Shita, and the Shulchan Aruch so paskins, although the Shulchan Aruch does not mention melech, obviously. So the Rambam learns, unlike the Rishonim that Rav Yaakov Emden brings, that pilagesh is only a heter for a melech. Pilagesh is not a heter for a hedjot, for a non-melech. Okay. Today, we don't have a category of melech, halachically, so nobody can have a pilagesh. So the question you're asking is one that I don't know if I have an answer for, and that is, okay, why should a melech be mutter b'pilagesh? Why would a melech want a pilagesh? How were pilagshim treated, and the like? The truth is, I honestly don't know. We really don't have any evidence of how pilagshim were treated. We know that just as a melech is not allowed to have many wives, he's also not allowed to have many pilagshim, that he shouldn't get distracted in the performance of his duties. But in terms of why would a melech elect to go with a pilagesh, it's not entirely clear. Now, in terms of royal succession, in terms of malchus going to a child, I do not believe that there's any, in other words, you might have a havamina and say, well, maybe the melech chooses the queens if he's willing to have his successor from them. But if he's not willing to have his successor from a woman, she'll be a pilagesh. And that way you're not going to have royal succession. That might be a havamina to think about, but I don't think it's emes. I believe that royal succession to the son of a king goes to whichever son is most suitable, and it makes no difference if it's from a wife or from a pilagesh. So all I can say is it's one of the prerogatives and privileges that are given to monarchs, but I don't know why in particular a king would elect
Think of
to go.
anything that we can learn from this halacha about how we relate to Hashem as the Jewish people, and how we relate to each other? That only the monarch has this privilege to basically have girlfriends?
Well, I will tell you this. There's a pasuk in Shir Hashirim that talks about there are 60 queens and 80 pilagshim, but only you, speaking about the Jewish people, you are my choicest. And Rashi explains that all of the seed of Avraham, including Yishmael and Esav, it's very strange, are called God's queens. And then the descendants of Noach that are not part of the Avraham line are called God's concubines. So in that poetic imagery, there is this difference based on relative closeness. What's quite astounding to me is that if you're classifying Avraham's descendants as the queens of God and the other Noachite descendants as the concubines of God, in the calculation of 60 that Rashi enumerates, the 60 queens, he is including Esav, Yishmael, Esav's children, Yishmael's children. To me, it's quite astounding, including Amalek. Yeah, it's quite astounding that you're including these Rishayim somehow on a higher spiritual level than some of the other Gentile nations that fall under the concubine standard. Right? It's a little, but that's where Yichus comes in, but they're still from Avraham, and therefore there's some privileged status that they have. But I don't know. I don't know why a king would decide this. See, it's very hard for us. we have, the Musar and the Midos that we understand we're supposed to live by, we primarily get from Chazal. The Mishnah, the Gemara, the Medrash, Pirkei Avos, books of Musar. And then one of the big difficulties, I'm just being very honest and open with you, one of the very big difficulties we have is when we try to match the morality of Judaism as taught by the Torah Shebaal Peh, and then we encounter biblical figures. There is sometimes a disconnect, meaning to say the behavior of the Jew of the Tanakh does not always correspond to the behavior of the Jew in the Torah Shebaal Peh. Now Chazal themselves recognize that problem, and often they bridge the gap by interpretation. They interpret the psukim in a certain way, but other times they don't really give us an interpretation. And it could be that some of the interpretations were lost, or Chazal just didn't give us an interpretation. And I think the issue of pilagshim is one of those issues that has not been clearly explicated in Chazal. Certainly, if we had some great Rosh Hashiva who was in the habit of taking pilagshim, we would look askance at it. We would not look at it as a good and kosher and noble thing. And yet the Torah allowed it for a melech, which means obviously it's not considered to be the most evil thing of all, and it was considered to be good within a certain context. So that's where we sometimes have a disconnect of how to make things fit in. So it is a problem that you'll encounter many times. And once again, it's kind of similar to what you asked me last week about Tehillim 137, smashing the heads of the babies on the rocks. How could that be? Once again, it's a disconnect between what the pasuk says and the morality of ne'alavim, to be humiliated and not to strike back, etc. So there are going to be those problems that we can't fully answer. Yeah.
Is davening vasikin more special than a later time?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
Is davening vasikin more special than a later time?
Oh, well, there's no question it is absolutely more special. Vasikin is a great mitzvah. Now, why is it so? So, number one, it is based on a pasuk in Tehillim where David HaMelech proclaims, Yira'ucha im hashemesh. We will revere you, God, with the sun. It's like you're participating in the cosmic praise of God. There is a notion when the sun rises every morning, it is singing a song of praise to God as the day begins. And you're joining yourself in nature in that chorus. So vasikin is a very, very beautiful thing. But as I indicated, if you're not going to do it on a regular basis, you wait until the minyan later. But if you want to do it on a regular basis, it may override even tefillah b'tzibur. Now, I will say that modern vasikin has lost a lot of the spiritual power. Today, vasikin means you want to start Shemona Esrei with sunrise. So now they have these atomic clocks that tell you exactly when the sun rises, even to the 10th of a second. So it'll say, 5:50 and 5/10 of a second. And they're watching the clock there, and they're up to Shemona Esrei, but they're not quite there yet, so they'll stretch out the last line. Baruch atah Hashem Goal Yisrael, to get it exact. So they're looking at the clock. They're not looking at the sun. They're looking at the clock. So I remember one time I had to daven at a vasikin minyan, and it was my father's yahrzeit, and I'd have to be vasikin minyan. So I asked if I could be chazan, and I was like 2 seconds late with sunrise. Whatever, it's hard to time it exactly. So they told me I could never daven there again because I missed sunrise. I missed vasikin. I was makalkel. Now let's think about this. When we ask ourselves, how did Chazal daven vasikin? Chazal didn't have clocks. There were no clocks. They were looking at the sky. And when they saw the sun rise, obviously it was an approximation. That's when you begin vasikin. So this notion that vasikin is somehow correlated to a 10th of a second is, I think, very, very foreign to the way it was done historically, but it's also foreign to the spirit of it. Because the spirit is you should be in awe of nature becoming a new day. And that inspires you. I'm looking at the sunrise and knowing that it comes from God. and all of creation is a testament to God's greatness and God's grandeur. Instead, I'm in a windowless basement with no windows at all, so I couldn't even see that was that particular case, and we're bending over looking at a clock. So you could ask the question, what's so great about Vasikin under those circumstances? Well, halachically it still is, but spiritually, I think we've taken a lot out of the experience of Vasikin. Yeah.
Here's another sentence. The Gemara in Gittin tells the story of how Shlomo HaMelech acquired the Shamir worm from Ashmadai. This story is very similar to Lahavdil, St. George and the dragon, since both Ashmadai and the dragon are symbolically chained to gain mastery of them. Did the Talmud inspire their stories, or is the taming of a formidable monster simply an archetype common to all humanity?
Yeah, well, those are excellent questions, and those may be controversial questions. The particular reference was to an Aggada in the 7th parak of Gittin that talks about a massive, gigantic king of the demons whose name was Ashmedai, and Ashmedai had to be subjected, he had to be trapped, he had to be subordinated, and the Gemara says the various tricks that were used to capture him, and after he was captured, he was able to identify what Shlomo HaMelech needed for the Beis HaMikdash, and that's the Shamir worm. Because, in the Beis HaMikdash you can't use iron tools, so we are told that the rocks were cut by a little worm that would eat through the rock. Today we would use lasers. Lasers would also be an alternative to the Shamir. By the way, there's a second part of the story, that Ashmedai eventually got Shlomo and took over Shlomo's malchus for a while and had to be discovered. So it went both ways. Shlomo got him and then he got Shlomo. Now the question was that there are similarities between, let's say, the story of Ashmedai, where a formidable opponent is disabled, versus St. George and the dragon, which has a similar story about a dragon. And obviously, one thing I can say for sure is that the St. George story is later, so for sure the Talmud didn't get it from St. George, which is Baruch Hashem, I don't have to answer that particular problem. But the question is, were these stories in Europe and in Christian culture, were they from the Talmud? Were they based on the Talmud? Or were there kind of just developments in people's consciousness, certain universal themes that kind of emerge different times, different places, different cultures, because they are universal archetypes, to use Carl Jung's terminology? The answer is, I don't know. The answer is, I think both are possible. Certainly, there is no question that Talmudic stories were known, at least some stories were known in European Christian culture. And there's no reason to doubt that they could have easily spread and then taken on different forms. But it's also the case that there are certain universal themes that emerge from human culture. The word mythology, again, this is a controversial word, because when you say something is a myth, that normally is kind of an insult. Oh, it's a baba maisa, it's not true, it's a story. But in reality, myth has a different meaning, actually. Myth means a symbolic exposition that represents an important idea in human psychology or philosophy. In other words, I'm going to say something that will sound like I'm an apikoros. Maybe I am for other reasons, but not for this reason. I'm going to say that many midrashim are myths. No hate mail, please. Now, when you hear the statement, many midrashim are myths, you expect me to be saying, they're stories, they're superstitious, they're foolishness. God forbid. God forbid. That's not what I mean by it. By a myth is exactly what the Rambam says. The Rambam writes in the Hakdama to Chelek that there are three categories of people in terms of how they look at Aggada and Medrash. Category one says everything Chazal says is 100% true, no matter what. The Rambam says these are God-fearing people who are fools. Category two say Chazal's statements are full of superstition and lies. Rambam says these are evil people who are apikorsim. So, if you say everything is literally true, you're a God-fearing fool. If you say it's full of falsity, you're an apikoros. Rather, the Rambam says the true approach to Aggada is every single thing Chazal say is absolutely true. But truth is not always understood in a literal way. Chazal used, in some cases, not in all cases, Chazal used metaphor, mashal, allegory, as a framework to convey deeply spiritual ideas. The spiritual ideas are true, but to make them more palatable, Chazal employed stories, which are not necessarily literally true. Now, the Rambam says that we don't know. Some midrashim are meant to be literal, and some midrashim are meant to be figurative and metaphorical. And he promised us that he was going to write a book to tell us which midrashim were this and which midrashim were that. What a book that would have been. Unfortunately, the Rambam never wrote the book. He never got around to it. So we don't have that book. But commentaries like Maharal and Ramchal try to go through this. So when I say something is a myth, that's not an insult. A myth is simply a form of symbolic thinking in which certain ideas are expressed through symbols that are not necessarily meant to be taken in a literal sense. In fact, in that sense, it's been well said by scholars of mythology that myths are sometimes truer than facts because they communicate deeper ideas. You know, a myth can teach me all about my life and my struggles. A fact might be, oh, I had a hamburger for lunch, like the stuff they post. Facts are just facts. Facts don't necessarily have any particular meaning. In a myth, there is always meaning. Okay, so for your own self-preservation in yeshiva, please do not use the phrase, medrash is a myth. They're going to kick you out if you say that. But in reality, if you understand what I'm saying, that is exactly what the Rambam says, that the truth of midrashim is not always literal, it is symbolic. So based on that idea, as human beings go through life and they have godly souls, there is the possibility of simultaneous, a certain idea emerging simultaneously in different cultures. And that is why in mythology in particular, you will see myths that transcend cultures. You'll have Greek myths, Roman myths, Norwegian myths, British myths, Scandinavian myths, South American myths, cultures that did not necessarily have any connection, but they deal with the same themes. So I'm perfectly open to that as a possibility. Yeah.
In this week's parsha, it sounds like Avraham is almost like negotiating with God in regards to Sodom.
Yeah.
And saying how zchut tzadikim sheharachmim on the entire city. And I understand Moshe Rabbeinu, being a negotiator for Am Yisrael, after when they mess up. But for people who are such achzari people, it just sounds so difficult that Avraham is advocating for them. And Chazal, especially when Chazal say that kol merachim al achzarim sofer lachzer al rachmanim. In this case, it sounds like Avraham is really advocating for them. What's the
Yeah, it's a difficult question. I mean, Avraham prays for Sodom. First of all, let me point out that it's interesting when God tells him to take his only son Yitzchak and bring him as a korban, Avraham doesn't argue at all. He just does it. But for Sodom, he argues. On that, I think I may have told you an answer, that there's a difference between a direct command and God just giving him the news. In the case of Akedah Yitzchak, God gave him a command. Once he gets a command, he doesn't question it. By Sodom, God just gives him the news, so Avraham feels he could argue. But your question is, are you supposed to, I mean, somebody asked me, for example, are you supposed to pray that Hamas doesn't get killed? Are you supposed to pray that Gaza, God show mercy on Gaza? Right? These are Rishayim. These are enemies who want to destroy us, destroy Jews, destroy every Jew in the world. And Sodom were Rishayim of that type of magnitude. So the question is prayer appropriate for them, right? It's one thing you pray for a Jewish people, etc. It's a hard question. I would say there is a difference that although Sodom were evildoers, their evil seems to have been contained within their society. I think that's a difference. You don't find Sodom doing terrorist operations, trying to kill other people. Their evil was within their particular place, and as a result, Avraham might have reasoned that there's always a possibility of tshuva. That there's always a possibility that as bad as people are, we can help them, work with them. Who knows what will happen to them, etc. As opposed to people who are actively trying to kill you. There you don't seek rachamim for them. But it is a good question. I think Rabbi Dr. Norman Lamb, Zecharno Livracha, was a longtime president and officially even Rosh Hashiva of YU. Once wrote an article about how, the yeshiva world has changed. Let's imagine today, a man would appear, Avraham Avinu would appear, and he would go to Times Square in New York. Times Square is a little cleaned up now, but it used to be a very immoral district. And he would start praying for all of the drug addicts and all of the criminals and all of the pickpockets and all of the murderers in Times Square. Undoubtedly, there would have been a declaration against him for being misguided and the like. The very thing Avraham did, if he would do it today, he would be condemned. So we've become a little more chomer. But still, you are right. I don't think even Avraham would pray for Hamas or whatever it would be. So it is a good question. By the way, for those of you who are liberal, it's interesting, there is a chazal that says that the real Avera of Sodom was they were anti-immigration. There's a chazal to that fact. Because Sodom was a very, very prosperous economy, and there were poor people who wanted to migrate to Sodom to try to make a living and benefit from its economic growth. And Sodom was afraid that these immigrants would deplete their economic wealth, so they had an anti-immigration policy where nobody was allowed to move to Sodom unless they were wealthy. And Chazal say it was that selfishness that caused the Churban of Sodom. So if any of you advocate, although today I don't think a sensible person would advocate for it, but if any of you wants to advocate for open borders in immigration, you could use that Chazal as a little bit of a source for it. Yeah.
I think by now most of us have heard about the Yeshua that many of the Shomer Shabbat communities that surrounded Gaza had on Simchat Torah, that basically the terrorists drove up, and the gates were closed,
Yeah, they
their
couldn't-
trick of waiting for someone to come open didn't work, and they moved on to easier targets. On the other hand, the worst devastation was at the rave. If you know a little bit about me, I used to be a touring DJ and sound systems engineer. I know what's going on at those raves. People, Gilia riot, openly breaking Shabbat, and even worse than that. There's I saw a picture of a temple to Buddha at the rave.
Yeah, sometime, yeah.
So, and I've been at other parties like that, so temples that are I've seen them. They are mamash avodah zarah. So what occurs to me is that Hashem's not really being very subtle with us here. The communication of what what Klal Yisrael is supposed to learn from this is not. I don't really feel like we have to go. Oh, what does Reb Chaim say? We need to really it seems like really the regular Am Haaretz should be able to get the picture.
Yeah.
And so my question is, one, is there an appropriate way for us to explain that to people who are still being openly Mahal Shabbat in the face of this very clear communication from Hashem? Is there a delicate way to talk about this? And two, how do we deal with the sense of fear and discouragement as people who are Shomer Mitzvot, that if we as Klal Yisrael are not getting the picture from this, then really, what's it going to take? And fear that coming event.
Yeah, this is actually a profoundly uncomfortable question because the one thing that we don't want to do when Klal Yisrael goes through its Tzara is kind of blame some other segment for the problem. Like say, oh yeah, they are the ones that caused this tragedy, because that kind of gives us an excuse not to engage in our own tshuva, our own cheshbon hanefesh, and it becomes self-righteousness, and it becomes arrogance, and it becomes gaiva So to point fingers at other people is always a very, 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 very dangerous and self-defeating exercise. I'll get back to, just to give you a story. I mean, years and years ago, I remember before I was a Rav of a shul, so I was a consumer of drushes instead of a giver of drushes, the good old days. So I went to 2 drushes in Baltimore. One was a yeshivish, real Haredi shul, where everybody was a ben Torah, and the drusha was about the importance of keeping Shabbos halacha, which everybody was doing. And anyway, okay. The shul was a little cold, a little unfriendly, but Shmira Shabbos Gilchasa. Then I went to a more modern Orthodox shul, where people were not so frum, but they were very friendly and warm. So the Rav spoke about the importance of greeting everybody, b'sever panim yafos. Both drushes were very excellent. But I was thinking to myself, it would have been so nice if the drushes would have been reversed. That the Haredi yeshiva shul that was not so friendly should hear about sever panim yafos, and the other shul, which already was sever panim yafos, should hear about the importance of Shabbos halacha. Now the way it worked then is, given the fact that you're preaching to the choir, as the expression goes, so when you're sitting in this Haredi shul and you're hearing the Rav talking about how important Shabbos is, you're thinking, yeah, that shul down the street ought to listen to the message. And when the shul down the street is hearing how important it is to be friendly, yeah, that shul down the street, right? In other words, a drasha shouldn't be that you're thinking about the faults of other people. So that's why it makes me very uneasy. On the other hand, I can't deny the reality of the situation. One of the Zemiras of Shabbos, written by Rav Avraham Eben Ezra, Ki yeshmera Shabbos kel yishmereni. When I keep Shabbos, God will watch over me. That it's not. So you don't even have to look at it as a punishment for Chilul Shabbos. You can look at it as Shmiras Shabbos brings bracha. I think that's actually maybe a better way of saying it. Hashem will protect me. Ki yeshmera Shabbos. And it's an amazing thing. I mean, it's on video where these terrorists, they're trying to get in and they can't. And they just give up. Let's go and let's murder some other village, whatever it would be. They couldn't get in. It took so little. I mean, it took so little to repel them. Just you have a closed fence and the like. And then you're right. The majority of the casualties were at this concert, and the concert is Kol Mine Toeva, Arayos, and even a Buddha, whatever reason that was there, but I heard that as well. So it is very, very clear that these Averas are a contributing cause, and the Torah itself says that when Eretz Yisrael is desecrated in this way, the land vomits us out. And the Ramban has a very important point, that Hashem will tolerate Averos in Chutz La'aretz that he will not tolerate in Eretz Yisrael. Sodom was a confederation of 5 cities. Sodom, Amorah, Adma, Tsevoyim, and Tsoar in Mitzrayim. But Tsoar was spared, and only the 4 cities were destroyed. And the Ramban explains that Tsoar was just as bad as the other cities, but they were in Eretz Yisrael. This was in Mitzrayim. HaKadosh Baruch Hu allows Chutz La'aretz to be in a certain level of tumah. So there's no doubt about it that when we look at these things, we do have to think about those Averas of Shmiras Shabbos. But I do think we then have to turn it back. Even so, we have to turn it back on ourselves, and that is, okay, what can I do as a person to try to spread the message of Shabbos and mitzvos to the world? Because if there are Yidden who don't keep Shabbos, it's not only their problem, it's my problem. Like, what could I have done that I didn't do? You see what I'm saying? So if you look at it in terms of your responsibility rather than blaming other people or looking down at other people, then I think something constructive can come out. And the emesis, there are, not as much as we would hope, but there are some constructive things emerging here. The sense of unity, the sense of achdus. If you remember the situation in Israel before the war, a month ago, and it's like a distant memory. People don't even remember it. Israeli society was being ripped apart over judicial reform, had all these demonstrations, and then the draft thing had all those demonstrations. And people were not just demonstrating, they were saying this is civil war. There was even a fear that soldiers wouldn't serve in the army, which Baruch Hashem didn't materialize. But they were talking about, not reporting to duty, civil unrest, end of Israel, and the like. And there was so much fighting, so much machlokas, so much sinas chinam on all sides of the coin. And Baruch Hashem, if we can talk about a silver lining in a time of tragedy and sorrow, there's a lot of unity, a lot of achdus. And Baruch Hashem, it's even been translated into greater mitzvah observance in some ways. I think I mentioned there are tens of thousands of soldiers who want to wear tzitzis. There's a big demand for tzitzis. It's hard to meet the demand. And a lot of them are not religious, or formally not religious. Tefillin, right? There are tzitzis campaigns, tefillin campaigns, davening campaigns. And non-religious people are responding, and it's because the religious people are dealing with them with love and with care and with concern. So yeah, I'm not a novice, and none of us can point to anything exact, but certainly the Chilul Shabbos, the pretzis, the immorality, has its cost. It has its cost, and we've seen the cost. But we have to ask ourselves, what can I do to make it better? I'm not here to criticize other people. Many other people are tinok shenishpa, they didn't learn. And I'll tell you an example. Rabbi Yashiv said once, and he said he thought there was no such thing as tinok shenishpa in Eretz Yisrael. He says, what do you mean? Every Israeli knows about religious Jews, right? You can't escape it. So how can you say, this Israeli never heard of Shabbos, never heard of kosher? Rabbi Yashiv basically said, halachically, that's impossible, because for sure they heard about it. If nothing else, their car got blocked at a demonstration of Charedim and the like. But I'll tell you that somebody told me, or I heard, I don't remember, I think it was a person directly witnessed this, that they were doing a Chabad thing, although they were not Chabad, but they were inviting a secular Jew to put on tefillin in the airport. And the secular Jew put it on, and he began crying as he remembered his childhood. And he had a daughter. And she asked her father, what is this? She never saw a pair of tefillin. And when he said, Shema Yisrael, she asked him, what are you saying? Now, this is frankly amazing, and I wouldn't have believed it. You can grow up Jewish in the state of Israel, and you have never heard the pasuk, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. It's amazing. I mean, it's unbelievable. I honestly did not believe it. Rabbi Yashiv said, sure, they heard about it, but you see Lamaisa, there are people who have not. And this was not even like, I don't know, it was outside of Tel Aviv. It wasn't like, well, Israel is a small country, but there's no middle of nowhere here. But there was no equivalent of the middle of nowhere in that situation. So as a result, I don't want to be outer focused on them. They may have a whole bunch of excuses, but I want to be focused on us. And yeah, I think this highlights the achrayus that we have to take to try to bring Jews to Torah, and we can only bring them to Torah with love, not with condemnation. Yeah, back.
This is an anonymous send-in question. If someone breaks Shabbos to save a life, for example, to turn on a light for a sick person, is that person allowed to benefit from that light, even if it's not for the purpose of that sick person?
Yeah, that's a very excellent question. Let's assume that somebody desecrated Shabbos. Well, it's not a desecration, but they did what would otherwise be a violation of Shabbos for a chola that had a sakana, and turning on a light would be included, because even though that doesn't cure him, but it makes him feel better, and that's nichlal in sakana. Is he, the person who turned on the light, allowed to benefit from a Shabbos desecration that was done for a chola sheyesh lo sakana? Because normally, when you do melacha on Shabbos, you're not allowed to benefit from that melacha, right? That's the general rule. The short answer is, in this case, you are. In other words, the halacha is beferish, that which you do for a chola sheyesh bo sakana, you are then permitted to benefit, because that's treated as a permissible action rather than an impermissible action. Yeah.
What's the Jewish view on the gallbladder and like
You say, there has to be a Jewish view on everything. What's the Jewish view of the gallbladder? Yeah, I suppose you're asking because we're not really sure what the function of the gallbladder is. The Gemara makes reference. There's quite a number of Mamari Chazal that refer to the gallbladder, to the Mara in various ways, and we do believe that Hashem did not put anything in the human body or in the universe that does not have a purpose. But I don't know. I'll check it. I don't recall if Chazal identified any particular purpose. But as a matter of hashkafa, it's absolutely the case that everything has a function. Everything has a purpose.
So would a person be able to remove it for no reason?
So I would say no. You should not remove it because there are purposes that you don't understand. Now, again, like anything else, if there's sickness, if there's infection, so you remove what you need to remove. But you don't indiscriminately just decide to remove something because if Hashem gave it to you, we don't believe in evolution. We don't believe it's just some vestigial organ. We believe it has a present function, so don't fool around with it. Yeah.
Another send-in. There have been a number of legal cases recently where usually English courts rule to take religious, Jewish or Christian children off of life support, despite perhaps some remote chance of an experimental trial that would work. Assuming one has exhausted all legal appeals, what is the Jewish obligation in the face of such circumstances? Does the principle of rodef require that one take up arms in defense of the child? Even such approach would only put
Yeah, so this is a very interesting question. The exact parameters are very, very complicated, and I'm not going to really address this, but suffice it to say, there are going to be times where halacha requires that we try to keep somebody alive, and secular law may not only permit, but even order that the person be taken off life support. Now again, when that would take me at least an hour and a half to go over, but let's assume that there's a scenario where halacha says this child must be on life support, but the courts have ordered that we no longer sustain these types of lives, let's take him off. So the question becomes, if I am an Orthodox Jew, and this could be in a number of ways. I'm either the doctor, or I'm the parent, or I'm just an Orthodox Jew who wants to protect human life. Can I regard this as rodef? In other words, the doctors or the nurses that are going to disconnect the life support, can I kill them because they're about to kill another human being based on their definition of death and everything else? Can I treat those who want to discontinue life support as rodfim, which would allow me to take extreme action or the like? Now, the problem there is, of course, that the rodef does not, see, a rodef is can get killed not as a punishment for his sin, but he gets killed to prevent the damage of his killing others. Now, do you understand the difference? I can kill a rodef not because of what he did, but to prevent him from killing somebody innocent. So as a result, that's exactly where you have the problem here. Some nurse comes in to take a kid off life support, so you shoot her because she's a rodef. Well, what's going to happen is somebody else will come in, under armed guard or everything else. So it would seem that in a situation where killing the rodef is not going to avoid the threat to the nirdav, there actually would be no heter. You would not even be allowed to kill the rodef if it's going to be inefficacious. So I would say that in this case, redifa would not apply. You try to pursue your legal avenues. Or maybe in an extreme case, kidnapping might work. It depends. This was done sometimes in Israel, not in this particular context, but in the context of autopsies. In the 60s and actually 50s, 60s, and 70s, Hadassah Hospital was doing autopsies on everything. Anyone who died in Hadassah Hospital got a full autopsy, which involves cutting up a corpse, dissection of a corpse, desecration of a corpse. And this is a major issue. Halacha may allow autopsies in certain areas, but it certainly does not allow indiscriminately doing autopsies for medical education or whatever it is. So that was an issue. Baruch Hashem, they don't do that. They don't do it anymore. The law was changed. But in the 60s, 70s, early 70s, there were many, many, many demonstrations against autopsies. But one of the things that some frum activists did was they would put on white medical jackets, impersonate doctors, come in with gurneys, into morgues, and literally steal the bodies. They would steal bodies, take them out of the hospital, and give them a burial, halacha. In fact, there are even stories they would take a dead body into a cab with them. In other words, they get into a cab and they would just tell the doctor, not the doctor, tell the cab driver, this guy had too much to drink. He was like falling around, and right, and they would bury him. Now, in the case of life support, that's a possibility, but it's much more difficult because if you're taking a person on life support out of the hospital, the question is, how are you going to keep him on life support? So, in some ways, I don't know if there's any satisfactory solution, but I don't think rodef is the way to go because rodef is not going to eliminate the threat. Bichlal. Yeah.
Could you explain why cheese is kosher, which is a mixture of milk and meat in the form of rennet? It's been explained to me that the rennet becomes batel b'sheshim, but that doesn't make sense to me because the rennet is the thing that turns the milk into cheese. The rennet's what makes it what it is. And plus, if it was batel b'sheshim, you still couldn't do it lehatchila. And then it's also been explained to me, I heard a different answer, that it's eitz ba'alma, but if it's eitz ba'alma and it doesn't have the status of meat anymore, then why is it required that the rennet needs to come from a cow that had shchit?
Yeah. So again, the idea of kosher cheese is an interesting problem. Historically, the way cheese was made, and most cheese is made even today, not soft cheese, not cottage cheese, but harder cheeses, is you need what is called a curdling agent, an agent that causes the milk to curdle into balls that solidify. And the agent that was typically used is something called rennet, which is from the lining of an animal. Now, the lining could be pig, could be cow, could be anything, and that's called rennet, and that's the major curdling agent of the milk that causes it to coalesce into cheese. Now, the problem basically is you're taking milk and you're introducing meat into milk, so isn't that going to be a problem of basar b'chalav? So here, let me explain something. Your question is a very good question, but la halacha, there's a difference between non-kosher rennet and kosher rennet. Now, non-kosher rennet is either from a pig or an unshechted cow. Right? That's non-kosher rennet. Kosher rennet is from a shechted cow. Now, non-kosher rennet, even if there's more than 60 times the volume of milk keneged the rennet is not batel b'shishim. It is not nullified in 60. And the reason that is so is exactly what you said, davar hamaimed, that which effects noticeable chemical changes in a product does not lose its chashivas. Meaning, if a drop of milk or even a drop of pork, falls into a meat soup, it's nullified. But where that drop is a catalyst for chemical transformations, there's no bittul. So, bottom line is, non-kosher rennet is not batel b'shishim, and therefore there is no heter to eat cheese that's made with non-kosher rennet. Now, your question is, but why don't you have the same problem with kosher rennet? Yeah, the rennet is kosher, but once you put it in milk, you got a meat and milk mixture, which should not be batel b'shishim, because the kosher rennet is mamid. It's a catalyst for chemical changes. It's a very good question. So the Rishonim say, and the Nosei Kelim and the Shulchan Aruch say, that the rule of davar hamamid, that which is a catalyst, is not nullified, only applies to a maimid of iser, but when it's a maimid, which is a substance of heter, and it only becomes usher through the combination with the milk, we will allow bittul b'shishim, even for davar hamamid. This is a klal that is said. Now, some cheese is in fact made with vegetarian rennet. They don't have chemical or vegetarian rennet. I honestly have to check the statistics, but I believe today, most kosher supervised cheese is made with vegetarian rennet. But the emes is, the Shulchan Aruch does allow even kosher meat rennet based on the fact that it's a maimed of heter. Yeah.
What is the obligation, or maybe there's the lack of obligation to sort of persuade or to educate non-Jews about to show them why what Israel's right to defend itself or protecting the Jewish people is important? Do we have any obligation to persuade or to teach the goyim?
Yeah. So this is the whole area that in modern Hebrew is called hasbara, and hasbara means propaganda. That's exactly what it means. And it was said that Israel was not as skillful in propaganda as the other side is, and I think we've seen that. And you're asking, to what degree is there an obligation? I think there is an obligation, and the obligation stems from two different sources. One source is the general idea of Kiddush Hashem, that if the Jewish people are doing something that is perceived by the world as immoral, that is perceived by the world as disproportionate, is perceived by the world as violent, then that casts the Jewish people in a very, very negative light, and therefore it's important in terms of Kiddush Hashem that the world understands that we're doing things that we have to do, not because we want to do them, and the danger is such that you have an enemy that wants to wipe us out, that they're the ones that are using human shields, not us, and that we give warning. So my point is that if I'm living in a world where people are looking at me and looking at me as evil and as a Russia, I do have an obligation to try to clarify that appearances may be deceiving, and there's a lot more here that you don't know. Now, maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. Unfortunately, it will not work to a large segment of the population, but it will work for some people. So one reason is Kiddush Hashem. Now, then there's a pragmatic reason that I think propaganda is part of our hishtadlus. Listen, it is Hashem that gives us the victory, for sure. But we do have to make human effort. We have to have an army. We have to train our soldiers. So part of our hishtadlus is that we need to curry favor with the nations of the world. And that's the nature of being in Gullus, in which part of our hishtadlus is to have a good relationship with the United States and other countries. So as a result, propaganda, I'm using it in a neutral term, hasbara, is a way of the other nations understanding what we're doing, and in that way they're more likely to support us and to help us. And even though obviously they're not the ones that are giving us victory, but it's our hishtadlus to try to enlist the different help. So the two bases for hasbara, I think, are Kiddush Hashem, which is a religious imperative, and hishtadlus b'derech hateva, that requires that you get the cooperation of the mausoleum.
Does it apply on an individual level? Because people spend lots of time on whatever social media trying to convince an individual.
Oh, okay, so that's a good question. Meaning, I think as a general rule, this is a Jewish societal imperative. Should you as a Ben Torah, spend a lot of time doing this? Frankly, I think there's a better use for your time. Meaning, a person has to prioritize his time. Propaganda or explaining Israel's case, is a useful thing, but it's not as useful or important as some other things. And if it's going to take away from your learning and your avodas Hashem, then I think you need to prioritize and know that the learning is a more important thing to do. But if you have, some spare time, it might be something, another service you can do for Klal Yisrael. Yeah.
Two of my great-grandparents were interred, not buried, in an above-ground Jewish mausoleum. Trying to give my ancestors a traditional Jewish burial would likely cost thousands, if not tens of thousands of dollars, and may also cause strife amongst my secular relatives who don't want to go against my great-grandmother's wish to be buried in such a mausoleum. Furthermore, I could see this project causing my family to lose any patience they have for me. With any future efforts, I try to make them that they lost patience with me. Nevertheless, the mitzvah to honor a Jewish family with a traditional burial is immense. Does HaRav recommend I pursue this project with such risks?
Yeah, this is a very difficult issue, the issue of mausoleum burials. We know that the Torah gives us a mitzvah of kavura, of burial, and the mitzvah of kavura is normally in the ground. Mausoleum burials are not acceptable halachically. Of course, in Israel, this is a current problem. All right, we don't bury people in mausoleums, but if you ever go to Har Menuchos, you will see something that looks like parking garages. They bury people because there's really a lack of space. And if you want a simple on-the-ground burial. You want an on-the-ground? I want to be buried on the ground. That's going to cost you $50,000 in Yerushalayim. $50,000. You can be too poor to die. See, what's interesting is Bituach Leumi, the national insurance in Israel, gives every Israeli citizen a free burial. You can get a free burial. But the only free burial you'll get in Yerushalayim is in the parking garages, which is like, it's a building, and they make niches in the wall, like catacombs in the wall. Or now they have something underground. It's an amazing thing. I saw the advertisement for it. In a way, it's ludicrous. It looks like a beautiful city, and they point out it is 78 degrees year-round, and you even have Wi-Fi connections. A little strange, but okay. And there's a very, very big shiloh halacha. People are debating. Rebbe Yoshev was very much against the parking garage. Kavuros, other poskim, the Rabbanut allows it because they say that's not really a mausoleum, because it's a small space that has dirt in it, and therefore it's like you're just raising the dirt. But a pure mausoleum, indeed, is not proper. The question becomes, how much do you fight for it? Again, it's a hard answer. I would recommend, this is a person in America. Is this your question, or you're asking for somebody else?
No, it's
Oh. Okay, so talk to me. I would recommend, and this is in the States?
Yeah.
I would recommend that you talk to a Rabbi Zon, who's the head of the Chevra Kadishas, the National Association of Chevra Kadishas, and he's in Queens. And he's a go-to person on all sorts of things, cremations and mausoleums. And he could probably give you some very practical advice as to how to proceed, because you are correct that this is important, but on the other hand, if it will endanger other things that you're working on, it may be that this may not be the issue to push. So contact me afterwards. I'll give you some information. Yeah.
So in this week's parsha, Lot's daughters slept with their father because they thought that everyone was destroyed. How is it possible that Lot's daughters thought that Avraham and Sarah were wiped out along with Sodom? Or is it that they knew that they were alive but didn't yet know that Hashem promised Avraham and Sarah a child? So from their knowledge, there were no other opportunities.
Right. So the big question is that we are told that Lot's daughters committed incest with him, and that's how they got Ammon and Moab 2 nights in a row. And Rashi explains that really their intention was for the sake of heaven, because they literally thought the world was gone. They looked like a nuclear landscape, and therefore they thought they were the last human beings, and therefore they had to reproduce, even though it was incestuous. So your question is, how could they possibly think they were the last survivors? They surely must have understood that if God saved Lot, he would, in the merit of Avraham, he certainly would have saved Avraham and Sarah, and Hashem promised Avraham and Sarah that they will have a child. So what was the hechrich? What forced Lot's daughters to assume that they would be the only way they'd have children? Yeah, again, it's a very excellent question. Of the two possibilities that you mentioned, I think the second one makes more sense to me, although I don't have a raya. Meaning they knew that Avraham and Sarah were alive, but they may not have been aware that Hashem promised them that they would have a child, because after all, Lot had been separated from them for a while, and maybe they even made the cheshbon that Lot was Avraham's kind of adopted son, and therefore whatever promises God made would be fulfilled through Lot. That might be the way it worked. But I don't think they thought Avraham had died. I think that's very unlikely in that case. Yeah.
This is partial also. Hashem has rachamim on Yishmael, and Hashem said that, and I saw him Vasher Husham. And I know that the simple understanding I had was that Hashem just viewed him where he was holding at that specific moment and didn't take into consideration what would be coming out of him. But it just, especially in light of everything that's been going on, it just still seems so difficult to swallow. How really that's how he was judged, especially in context like a Ben Sora Morim, who was like Nidon Hashem Sofa.
Yeah.
Yeah,
so this is again a famous question that the Marsha asks in Maseches Rosh Hashanah. We say that as Yishmael was apparently dying of thirst, the angels said to Hashem, let him die because his descendants are going to persecute us so much, persecute the Jewish people so much. And Hashem said, Asher Husham, right now, he is not such a rasha. Right now, he is relative, obviously it's relative because he was expelled, but he's relatively righteous. And therefore, I judge him the way he is and not the way he will become in the future. So people ask the kasha, we look at the Ben Sorer Umoreh, the rebellious son. Now the rebellious son, all he did was steal from his parents. He didn't do anything else. And he's not chayav misa because of his stealing. So why is he executed? Now again, Chazal say it never happened because there's a lot of technicalities, but at least on the books, there is a death penalty for Ben Sorer Umoreh. And the Mishnah says, Nidain al Shem Sofa. He is judged on the basis of what he will do. Meaning to say, he starts off this way, he'll eventually turn into a ganef who will murder people. So Hashem says, let's kill him now, so he'll never turn into the guilty person who will kill people. So you see mamish opposites, right? Asher Husham says, I look at you now, not what you'll be in the future. And Nidan al Shem Sofo is, I'm going to destroy you for what you will do in the future, even though right now you're not so bad. So the Maharsha asks the question. The Maharsha gives a few answers. One answer is that the Ben Sorer Umoreh, he himself will become the rasha that will do the killing. In other words, Yishmael, the taina was, his descendants will be the Rishayim. So Asher Husham means Hashem is not going to destroy you because of the rishus of your descendants. But Nidan al Shem Seifa might mean that you will be judged for what you yourself will do. Or the other thing is that the negative behavior that will culminate in murder by the Ben Sorer Umoreh has already started, meaning there's already been a start of that negative behavior. Apparently Yishmael, there must have been something negative, but apparently the negative root of that hatred did not yet start. So those are two things the Maharsha says.
Question to that would be like, let's say also like a little like baby Amalek, for example. Also this like same.
Yeah, you are correct. That one of the arguments of Amalek is that we kill even the babies because they will grow up to be Hitlers. So Amalek, according to that idea, is connected to Nidain al Shem Sofa. Yeah, that is a good kasha. But again, Amalek is a unique category, really. We don't extrapolate Amalek. It's very interesting. The whole tendency of halacha is to narrow it. We don't know who they are. We'll only do it when Mashiach comes. So in some ways, I don't know. You can't fully generalize it. Also, let me make another point. Although the Gemara doesn't say it, so that's a problem. With Yishmael, there is a concept that Yishmael himself did tshuva. And Chazal say, B'yacharis hayamim, the nations of Yishmael will do tshuva. So that itself already is a difference, meaning, yeah, they'll become Rishayim, but they will also leave that category of Rishayim. So if you're looking at the future, you got to look at the future positive outcomes and not just the future negative outcomes. I mentioned this morning that the Meshech Chochmah says, even the conversion of the Arab nomadic Bedouins from paganism to Islam was a first step in their tshuva by believing in God. And the second step would be they will renounce their violence against Am Yisrael, which I think you might have seen in the Abrahamic Accords with the Emirates, Dubai, the Emirates, etc., which is unfortunately now in the back burner. So there is a process simultaneously with the violence of Hamas. There was a bit of a tshuva movement on the part of different Arab peoples. Yeah.
I read in Adin Steinsaltz that one of the things that shapes the ritual forms of Judaism is the absolute prohibition against fashioning a statue, icon, or a mask. And yet we see in the Parsha of the Golden Calf that when Moshe comes down the mountain, he covers his face with a mask when it is radiant.
Yeah.
So my question is that I think that it could be fair for one to assume that at this time, everything that Moshe did was ritual on some level. It was probably the closest thing that we had to an actual, real, live, walking human Sefer Torah. He's like the Sefer Torah, as God told him to do. And so therefore, how can he don a mask, which Rabbi Steinsaltz explains is fundamentally prohibited in opposition to idolatry at all levels at the very point of transmission of the Torah to the Jewish people.
You know, I'm not quite sure what he means about a mask. I get the thing about images, about not donning a mask, but I'm assuming he's referring to kind of a ritual where you would put on a face of some type, a face which expressed some type of deity, some type of God that you would be worshiping. Now that's very different than just a cover. In other words, Moshe Rabbeinu didn't have a mask. It wasn't a mask. It was, he covered, just like you cover your head with a talus, he covered his head because his light shone. In fact, if anything, you can look at it as anti-idolatry, because here if you have a man who's walking around with the light of God shining from his face, people might worship him as a god. So if anything, this was not a mask to kind of create the worship of something. This was a mask so people wouldn't worship him in many ways. So I think it's an opposite thing. And again, look at the analogy, married men who wear a talus, we put a talus over our heads, right? So we don't call that a mask. We're just kind of, we're enveloped by it.
It turned out to be a semantic question.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
I'm not sure who says, but Chazal say that when you're in your mother's womb, you learn Kol Torah Kula, and then the angel slaps you, and then that's what you have.
Yeah.
I just wanted to know, Goyim also have it, so do Goyim also learn Torah?
Yeah. So it's interesting that, I have to know where the source of the second part of it is. The statement that before you're born, the Malach teaches you all of the Torah and then hits you and you forget it, that's in the Gemara. That actually is in the Gemara. But the statement that this is the indentation above the upper lip, that is not in the Gemara. So I'm wondering, I'll try to see if I can find out if that's just something that people add or it's actually a makor in Chazal. But let's assume that, because I've heard that also. Let's go with the assumption that this represents the Malach hitting you. So why do Goyim have it? Do Goyim learn Torah, right, etc.? I think the answer is they do learn Torah, but it's not the same Torah. They learn the 7 commandments of Noach with all of the details. They learn an understanding of Hashem, and their whole life they have to try to live up to what they learn. So Torah is understood in a less literal way than the 5 books of Moses or whatever it is. So I think there would be Torah for Goyim too. Yeah. Does Hamas have a din of Amalek? I would say no. I would differentiate between the spiritual idea of Amalek and the halachic construct of Amalek. The halachic chiyuv to kill Amalek is based on a very specific nation. This is the grandson of Esav. So Hamas is not genealogically Amalek. Hamas is not the nation of Amalek. You see? So if you were to ask me, do I have a mitzvah to kill Hamas the same way I have a mitzvah to kill Amalek? The answer is no. My mitzvah to kill Hamas is not because they're Amalek. My mitzvah to kill Hamas is because they're a rodef, and Abba Lahargacha, someone is coming to kill you or kill someone else, you kill them first. It's a different orientation. So I wouldn't say there's a mitzvah to kill the babies of Hamas, even though there's a likelihood that they may grow into this, but right now we would not kill them. Now, there is, however, a spiritual idea of Amalek. It says in the name of Rav Chaim Soloveitchik that any nation that wants to destroy the Jewish people is Amalek. But I don't think Rav Chaim meant that halachically. Rav Chaim meant that in terms of the rishus, in terms of the evil, but the halacha itself is limited to a particular nation.
How about the Nazis?
I would say the same thing with the Nazis. The Nazis were the closest you could imagine. In many ways, I would say Nazi ideology is more Amalek-like than even Hamas. Because Hamas at least has the claim that they want land. Now, there's Hamas can characterize its position as we want this land because this is our country. Nazi Germany didn't have that one even. So in terms of pure hatred, Nazism absolutely is the koach of Amalek, but halachically, I still would say they're not Amalek either. Right? You have to be very careful. I mean, listen, we read in the Evan Shleima, I'm going to quote the Evan Shleima again, the Gra talks about the Rav, the influences of the Rav in Am Yisrael. And he mentions that in Am Yisrael, there are whole segments that are connected to the Rav, and he mentions Balei machlokes v'lashon hara. And they are also called Amalek. So the Gra says that a Baal Lashon Hara, a Baal Machlokes, is called Amalek. Now, got to be careful. What does that mean? That means if somebody is a Baal Machlokes, I can take out my knife and kill him? Almost certainly not. So you have to understand that sometimes we are referring to spiritual kochos, but we're not referring to the technicalities of the mitzvah of Amalek. And that's important. And that's why it's a little dangerous to use Amalek as a term, because some ben yeshiva will hear the word Amalek and carry it out in a maisa, when it really was not meant to be lemaisa in that way. Yeah. Okay.
This is more of a philosophical question, but I
Yeah.
kind of debate with our friend. I wanted to know if the Rav holds that without a God, if morals would exist, and then a follow-up question to that is that if a baby grew up with no sense of morality, like in a forest, would it feel tsar or any feeling of guilt with stealing or murdering? Is it an inherent part of a human being, or does it need to be taught?
Yep. There's a nice book that was written many, many years ago, and it was by Dennis Prager and Joseph Telushkin. Joseph Telushkin has remained an Orthodox rabbi, modern Orthodox rabbi. Dennis Prager, who's now become somewhat famous, is a traditional Jew who's no longer Orthodox, but he was Orthodox at the time. And they wrote a nice book. It's a nice book to give to somebody, to a non-religious relative. It's called, the first edition was called 8 Questions People Ask About Judaism. And then they did a second edition called 9 Questions People Ask. They added a question about intermarriage. But one of the questions they ask, and they give nice answers, is, can there be morality without belief in God? Can there be a notion of natural conscience and the like? And they basically make the argument that Dostoevsky makes in Crime and Punishment, where he says, without God, everything is going to be permitted. Meaning, there is no morality without God. Now, you may ask me an obvious question. Well, wait a second here. There are atheists in the world, and not every atheist is a murderer or a rapist or a criminal or a serial sex offender. Are you telling me there's no such thing as a good and decent atheist? There certainly is. I mean, I'm willing to say, I'm sure Sam Harris, even Christopher Hitchens, I'm sure in their normal, everyday behaviors, they were perfectly normal people. But that's when you're not under stress. When push comes to shove, and you're faced with dangers, or you're faced with pressures. If you don't believe in God, why shouldn't I steal if I can get away with it? Why shouldn't I kill if I could get away with it? And I needed to get away with it. So I think a very strong argument could be made that without God, there is no basis for morality. But now let me make the opposite point. No, but I would say this. If without God there is no basis for morality, but I feel morality anyway, I naturally feel morality, then I think that's proof that there's a God that put that conscience inside of you, gave you that neshama. In other words, I'm not saying if I don't believe in God, I don't have morality. I'm saying the other way around. If I have morality, it came from God. It came from God. And that's why we believe that even a child who grew up in the jungle without any influences at all would come to some sense of normal moral behavior because it is imprinted in him, in his divine soul. And when we talked about the angel teaching you Torah before you're born, that's part of the Torah that the angel is teaching you. The principles of morality. That's why non-Jews will have it as well.
Hamas or like Nazi Germany, like how do
these
kids are killing at the age of 12?
No, you're right. You're right. The answer is that you can be brainwashed. That is very, very true. You can be brainwashed. You can be hypnotized. You're correct. A kid that just grew up in the forest wouldn't be that way. Wouldn't be that way. In fact, that's what they say. When you call murderous terrorists their animals, you're insulting the animals. Animals, live the way they're supposed to live. They do the best they can in their environments. But this is how powerful brainwashing is. It's brainwashing. It's not that they have an evil nature, but you take a kid and you train him from the time that he's 2 years old to hate Jews, to hate people, to kill, to believe that violence is the best thing. So you're perverting. But again, people would ask, well, does Hamas is Hamas made in the image of God? Are Nazis made in the image of God? I hate to say it. I believe they are made in the image of God, but they destroy it. They smash it. But I believe, the baby that was born in a pure state that could have been nurtured in the right direction, And the hope would be, if there's any hope, I mean, without Mashiach, there's no hope, but the hope would be that somehow there would be a generation of people, as Chazal say, that would come to some type of tshuva and realize that they have to move away from this. We hope, yeah.
Speaking of animals, in Hilchot Nezikin Mamon, we see a clear hierarchy of damages according to the level of responsibility or irresponsibility of the owner. A muad action and shein v'regel in public is zero responsibility for the owner. A tom action of an attacking sort has half damage in every area. The expected damages of shein v'regel in the rishon and nizak, you pay the full amount. And if these attacking behaviors become muad, then moving up the hierarchy, then in the public domain, it is also a payment of the full amount, despite it being in the public domain. But then the hierarchy stops. And in the domain of the nizak, still the muad, the attacking action which became muad, still is paying the full amount, just like a damage that was shein v'regel. So I was wondering if you could help with any insight about why the hierarchy comes to a sudden halt.
That you're asking, why is shein v'regel in the rishus of the nizak?
The same damage as Karen, which became muad in the rishut hanizak, is the same compensation of mishaleh.
In other words, why don't we differentiate between tam and muad by shein and regel? I mean, in other words,
no.
Yeah, I'm trying to get exactly what.
So the question, I'm sorry, it's a bit technical in the sugya, but the question is that it seemed to me that the penalties are organized very rigidly according to how much achrayot the Baal Habayit had in the situation.
Right.
So it goes up in terms of how much he has to pay, with balance towards how responsible he was towards that area that he doesn't have. And then suddenly, when it gets to the issue of a Karen action which became muad, now he's paying the same amount for damage that happened in the Rishut HaRabim as the Rishut HaNizak.
No, but I think, again, maybe I have to go through the sugya in more detail, but I think the basic idea is that once you reach muad is the apex of responsibility, meaning to say, once you know you have a habitual, dangerous animal, an animal that has gored, 3 times, so then at that point we make no difference if it's public, private, you have a responsibility to guard that animal and not let it perpetrate damages. So all of the presumptions that allow you to kind of walk with my animal in the public domain without liability or partial liability just cease to exist once you're muad. In other words, muad trumps everything at that point, because muad creates unlimited responsibility, no matter what area, no matter what.
So it's more like, instead of there being a hierarchy, it's that once the Karen action has become muadified, it's now made to be equal.
That's correct. There is no liability distinction at that point. Okay, I'm going to stop here. But anyway, thank you, and much hatzlacha.